So, part two. Life is a very strange world, very strange place. An odd experience. So, we were talking about my early teens. It wasn't until I became a teenager, but I think I really began to get some grasp of how profoundly lonely I had been, and also how profoundly frustrated I had been. No, I think I had a good idea of the frustration much earlier than that, but the loneliness that came with time. I think as a child, it's very easy to immerse yourself in the world of your family and the world of your fantasies and hobbies. But when you hit your teens, suddenly there's a real feeling that you ought to be connecting with other people your own age, and I wasn't. Um, as often happens in your teenage years, a ton of different things happened almost simultaneously that massively changed my life. And I think one way I could title this era of my life was probably in Charles Dickens' It Was the Best of Times and It Was the Worst of Times. It was the best of times because I would discover my own personal identity and finally get a grip on who I thought I was and what I thought my life was about, and um, and finally feel comfortable and confident in my own self. Um, and it was the worst of times because the huge struggle to actualize and realize that personal identity was ultimately futile and in vain, and I fought a losing battle to be the person I thought I was supposed to be, the person whose own skin I felt comfortable in. Um, so first things first, um, the the first probably big major thing in order, as far as I can recall, was the Toronto blessing. That happened, and that had a massive impact on my life spiritually. Um, those of you outside of the Christian sphere will probably not know anything about this. It was this kind of charismatic movement that happened in the in the mid 90s, early 90s. Um, where people suddenly started believing in kind of the power of God again in a big way. There was a big charismatic revival. People started believing in personal experience with God. There was a really big emphasis in spiritual experiences, spiritual power, spiritual gifts, praying for people's healing. Um, but also this phenomena of people having ecstatic laughter, just like you've heard of like primal laughter therapy and that sort of thing. It was a little bit like that. You just see people just moved spontaneously to start laughing, and it did look rather flaky and weird at the time. But alongside that, there was this huge growth in this emphasis in personal spiritual experience with God, and that was great because I'd come from a very conservative background. The churches that my mum had kept me in were C of E, and they were very conservative, and they were very not charismatic. And my personal understanding of religion was, from a very young age, very charismatic, very built on personal experience, very built upon a belief that there should be some sort of divine involvement in human affairs. I did not believe and do not believe in this notion of a kind of at an arm's length God who doesn't really care about what's happening on earth. I very much believe in personal relationship and in the world from the Almighty. And this Toronto blessing kind of massively woke something in me, this huge desire to kind of see my life become not just my life, but also to transform other people's lives. I wanted to transform my life and I wanted to transform other people's lives to make them better, to set right the wrongs of the world. Um, and that manifested in a lot of different ways. But one of the things that started to grow upon me as I was sitting in these meetings and watching lots of people laughing and rolling around on the floor in giggles, um, was actually this was not the revival. Revival is a word uh, that kind of old-fashioned Pentecostal charismatic Christian word for a kind of a new move of God's power in our time. But it's become associated with meetings or a revival meetings, revival tent meetings, was kind of things people used to do. Um, but actually, when I looked into these meetings, people laughing and all that, I thought the real revival that God wants isn't this. This is just a prelude. The real revival God wants is out there on the streets, touching the lives of the people who do not know Him and are not uh, moved by this charismatic. Um, I won't say theatre because it wasn't theatre, but certainly this charismatic renewal, if you'd like to say it, this malarkey. Um, the people God really wanted to reach were the people on drugs, the homeless people, the people in desperation, the people Jesus would have gone to. Um, and I'm thinking to myself, we talk about the power of God to knock someone over and to give them a fit of giggles, but the power of God to help someone out of a broken situation is far more meaningful. And that's what I think we need to be focusing on transitioning from this to something that's out there. And that's what I wanted to do and wanted to be a part of. I really had this burning desire to see the power of God um, change impossible situations. And I'm talking the miraculous, like I really desperately wanted to see people healed from illnesses and things like that, having seen so much horrible suffering in that area, but also people whose situations in life were just hopeless, people who were hooked on drugs, who were uh, trapped in abusive families, abusive relationships, who were in impossible situations where they'd hit the bottom and there didn't seem to be any ladder up. um, I wanted to see God reach out and change these lives, and I wanted to be a part of that. And that desire was birthed in me in that time, um, and kind of greatly accelerated my personal relationship with God and my personal sense of direction. And so that was hugely, hugely influential. The next thing that was hugely, hugely influential was going to a King's Kids boot camp. And yeah, King's Kids was at the time a kind of evangelical outreach that took young people. It was like the younger section of Youth with a Mission, which is a missions organization, and would get them involved in kind of spiritual activities, making a difference, reaching out to people, mostly in sort of performance arts. There's a lot of performance arts, a lots of singing, dancing, drama, that sort of thing. And they would do evangelical missions built on performance arts, where they would take you to a camp, like I suppose, not necessarily band camp, but like a theater camp or something like that, where they would do dance uh, and play acting and things with you for a weekend. And then at the end of that, they'd organize some sort of evangelical event in a city center or some other location where they would take you up and they'd have you give a number of performances with kind of Christian missions content, and you would kind of do that. And the notion was not just to kind of do this as a one off, but to kind of plant an organization that would do this continuously. And that was kind of the notion of the King's Kids boot camp. And now you know that background information. I can tell you that when I went there, I was like a month shy of 13, raging full of hormones, incredibly socially awkward, shy, very, very much a mommy's boy, very lonely, very out of my place, away from home, staying, I think for the first time, staying overnight with someone who wasn't a family member, and totally like a fish out of water. I remember turning up and the guys my own age, I just wasn't gelling with at that point. Later on, I would come to like them a lot better, but they were just like all football and fart jokes, you know? And I did not gel with that at all. The older girls, a lot better because they seem to be interested in interesting conversations. And I would have interesting conversations with them, but it certainly didn't hurt that one or two of them were very, very easy on the eye. And there was one in particular I remember coming in and looking over at this girl, and I think she'd come in a ballerina outfit. I don't know why. I think she'd come in from like a lesson or something, but she was in some sort of very kind of pink, satiny, tight uniform with a powdered face and her hair scraped back in a bun. And just the sunlight catching it just the right way. And I thought, wow, which would have been bad enough, except of course she was also really, really fun and interesting as well. Appealed to me as being a bit of a wild person. You see, they say opposites attract, and I was definitely interested in someone who felt able to just do things so freely, just open their mouth so freely and have all the conversations and didn't seem to be ever intimidated or hesitant. Um, yeah. So certainly there were certain things that were thrown into motion around that age that were certainly kicking into high, high gear, that I was completely unable to express because because every time I'd approached those sorts of topics in my family, it was always very, very off put and like we don't talk about this sort of thing kind of stuff vibe. So I just didn't know how to express it to anyone. But I was basically thinking about girls 24/7, which is pretty perfectly normal when you're just coming up to 13. And yeah, very, very normal. But no one told me it was very, very normal, and no one said it was okay. And certainly nobody explained to me how to bloomin' express or approach any of these things going on inside of my head. Particularly, certainly not with women anyway, with girls. So this side of my life was pretty much insular and in my head, and I was kind of just drawn to them without necessarily being overt about it, which probably made things a lot easier because that kind of allowed them to take this very shy guy who was younger than them and perhaps be a little bit motherly, which kind of allowed me to spend more time with them, I imagine. Um, but yes, things did not go well with the boot camp. I mean, things went really, really well with the boot camp. It was a fantastic success. I think it was run by Andy Kennedy, whom I had a great deal of respect for at the time. But the organization that would be set up after did not go well. It went well for a while. There was like a year where they kind of did exactly what they were supposed to do. They discipled us. We had regular monthly meetings. We did regular outings and did evangelical things. But the leaders seemed to be getting progressively more and more skittish. One of them was a social worker, and she was keep saying, "I keep worrying the police are going to come along and make a fuss about us being here with an amplifier and having so many people." And we applied for a permit, and they said we had 15 people here, but we've actually got 16 kids, and so on and so on and so on. Or I can't say that in this politically correct age. Can't evangelize in this politically correct age. They'll call us uh, street preachers, and the kids will be carted off. And so just we progressively got more and more timid in our outreach, and it frustrated me immensely, immensely. And at the same time, I was kind of formulating this sense that really we shouldn't need the adults to lead us to some extent. I came up with this idea. I actually shared it around. Because being Mr. Organized, I came up with plans and statements of intention and documents and things. I said, wouldn't it be good if we had an organization that was driven by young people, a young person organization run by young people, that did evangelism. And I used to use this term, we need to have more kamikaze Christians. And that was my reaction to the timidity I felt at the time. Not because I thought we needed to be reckless, but because I thought we needed to be utterly fearless when it came to um, being willing to take a risk in order to push things forward. And uh, yeah, I had a huge amount of respect from the leaders of that particular organization, but absolutely no cooperation. They're like, nope, we respect Peter. He's forthright. He says what he thinks. He has some really hugely passionate for Jesus, has some strong ideas, but this is not what we are doing. And they kind of scaled back and cut back. And as they cut back and did less, fewer people came. The membership dwindled. And I think when I was 15, 16, they just folded, and they did it in quite a sad way. I was really quite hurt by the way it all happened. At that point, I was one of the only people, because it was an interchurch thing. I was one of the only people who wasn't from the one church that's mostly provided the venue. Almost everyone who wasn't from their church had left. I think I was one of the last. And at that point, that church that provided the venue for the meetings got their kids together and said, we're going to stop hosting this. We think that there's no point having a separate thing anymore. You're hardly doing any evangelical work anymore, as I understand it. I don't know exactly what was said because I wasn't invited to the meeting. They didn't hold a meeting for the group. They just announced it internally in their church as if it was their thing to just turn it off because they had the venue. And that was it. They didn't inform me. They didn't tell me. They never consulted me. It was just kind of internally decided in their church. And because I was one of the few people who wasn't for a part of their church, it felt very much like they were just drawing a line to exclude me, because I'd become progressively more and more vocal about how we needed to be bolder and to push out more, and how kids can and should be willing to take risks for God, young people. Um, because it was around this time, well, I'll come back to that later. I'll come back to that thought later. So shortly after my 13th birthday, my parents, desperate to kind of get me back into school, put me into the worst school possible. It was the worst. So this is overlapping. This happened almost instantaneously. I went to the boot camp shortly before my 13th birthday. I think I entered this school not long after. This went on for a couple of years at least for the school, and more for the network. It was the worst possible school they could have put me in. It was a very strict, religious, small, badly equipped, badly funded private school. Basically, this very small church had decided that they were going to start a very small Christian school for some of the kids in their church. They didn't really know what they were doing. They had one full-time teacher who wasn't properly qualified, and my parents badgered them to accept me as a student who was, I think, technically older than any other student they had, and not really suitable. I think they had a 12-year-old girl, and I was 13, and that was basically it. That was basically the two oldest kids there, and as you go back, it get progressively younger into the kind of the 11s, 10s, 8s, 9s. So it was really more of a middle school than a high school or a primary school. And to be perfectly honest with you, it was dreadful. This point in time when I was having this huge spiritual transition in my life, where I was on fire for Jesus and very, very charismatic, which both my parents were, well, certainly my mother, they put me in a school that was basically Calvinist and cessationalist, and believed that spiritual gifts were of the devil and all of this sort of nonsense. And the age of miracles has passed, and very, very strict. And but didn't have the resources to teach a kid with learning needs, um, who was very, what you might say, cognitively unbalanced. And by unbalanced, I mean in terms of having areas of profound strength and profound weakness together in the same kind of educational context. Um, they did not know what they were doing. And I, for my part, was suddenly thrown together with other young people for whom I didn't necessarily have anything in common with. And it was a lot of friction. Um, and all of my bad behavior probably was focused there because it was the place in which I was under the most pressure. And it's a place where I felt the most restrained. Um, yeah, I was always kicking off all the time. And not reasonably in some cases, because they really didn't make any allowances for me whatsoever. And it was there I kind of started to become profoundly aware of my own autism, which hadn't yet been diagnosed or labeled. I remember turning to a teacher and saying, I don't think I feel things the way you feel them, by which I mean physical feelings through your skin. And she said, "No, you're full of nonsense." I said, "No, I really don't. I have to have all of the labels cut out of all of my clothes. I have all of these sort of issues. And I think that the way that I experience the world through my five senses is profoundly different from yours. I think I must have some sort of genetic mutation that means that my senses, my five senses, are experiencing the world differently than yours, because I do not find any other explanation for why my experience of things like clothing and um, so on, and sound and smell and temperature can be so profoundly different to yours, because it clearly is." And I just got called a whining baby. And of course, now we know that this is actually diagnosed features of autism. This is part of autism science and autism research. That these are things that we are mutants who have a different sensory perception of the world. Um, but yeah, so I felt very much gaslit there. Um, I felt very much trapped there, and I also felt very much shamed there. And I guess my response to that was probably to move in the opposite direction. I don't know. I know that I was very badly behaved with the other girls there. Not, I was never like that at the boot camps or anything like that. But um, I remember um, there was one or two of the older girls, 12, about a year younger than me at most. And I'd be like, we're playing tag, and I'd be like, okay, how about this for the game of tag? If I get to catch you, I get to kiss you. And we're like, no, no, no. Just because I was basically a little pent up ball of frustration on so many different levels, including that. And I just did not know any way to kind of express it. But also, I just was always at loggerheads with the teachers, because everything I said either upset them or upset somebody, and they just seemed intent on drilling boredom into me as if it was a virtue. Uh, so eventually, my behavior became so bad that they insisted I get tested for special needs. And what came out of that was not an autism diagnosis, because unsurprisingly, if you go to the Dyslexia Institute for a diagnosis, you tend to get diagnosed with dyslexia. And I am dyslexic. Um, but really, they should have been looking a bit more deeper. Um, and so when they came back with this diagnosis that says this child is profoundly dyslexic, and bear in mind, this is a private school before the days of the Equality Act, they said, okay, that's it, he's out. We're not having him anymore. He's out, he's gone. Goodbye. He was a bit too old for our school anyway, and if he's got special needs, we certainly can't provide any support for that. It's just beyond our means. Goodbye, he's gone. And I don't think they'd be allowed to do that anymore these days. But at the time they could. And I had no regrets about that whatsoever, because I absolutely hated the place. But it made me profoundly aware how huge the distinction, the gap between myself and other young people was. Both the network and the kind of the Light Factory network, as it was called, and also the King's Kids Network and the school both made me profoundly aware that I did not think and feel the same as other young people. And some places were willing to make some degree of allowance for that, and some places weren't. I think one of the reasons that maybe I wasn't called into that meeting when they decided to wind down the King's Kids Network was because I was not gelling with the leadership, and I was not necessarily even gelling with the other young people, although they clearly liked me. See, at least in the King's Kids Network, they liked me, but they didn't know how to handle me. And my passion and my drive was so at cross purposes with what they had already decided they wanted to do. But I think that they found it easier to just sideline me. And that's a repeated story. I got sidelined over and over and over again. So, what else? So, the thought I'd been waiting on and was coming back to um, was largely that hmm, was largely, I think, that but I've forgotten it. Well, let me talk about what happened next, and maybe it'll come back to me. You see, because I got involved in this church, my parents finally, or my mother particularly, finally gave up on trying to engage me with the C of E. I kind of didn't fit there, particularly not in this conservative, high church C of E. Um, so we started going to a little church in the city over, about 40-minute drive away. Um, and that was very on fire and very dynamic and very unlike anything that you've probably ever heard of, particularly for a young person. So, yeah, this is what I was starting to talk about. And this is where I started to realize around the time I started going to this church, and around the time I started towards the end of the King's Kids Network, which lasted like what 3 or 4 years, I started to get a sense of how I thought my life was supposed to go, my destiny, how it was supposed to be. So this church's youth group um, was unlike any you would imagine or have seen before, in that it was pretty much 100% run by the youth. I have a video of a guy called Duncan, who was the youth leader at the church at the time, in an Eastern European country, giving a kind of a sermon on his work in the youth group. And he'd say to you, I do not consider myself a youth leader. I consider myself a youth facilitator. Everything you see, the meetings, the group, the organizations, the missions work, um, the band, everything that you're seeing in front of you is pretty much all them. I facilitate. Right? I facilitate. I'm the adult face of this group. I make the things happen that that wouldn't happen if there wasn't an adult to pick up the phone and make representations. This youth group effectively runs itself. And he took a certain degree of pride in this, I think, at the time. Um, I don't think he'd feel that same way a few years later. And in fact, he totally 180 a few years later. But at the time, he had great faith and passion for that. And I was just so thrilled to be a part of this group. I thought they were the bee's knees. This youth group in this little church that ran its own meetings and that were deeply involved in the church's mission activities. They kind of ran a regular live concert in one of the local churches. They ran all-night prayer meetings for young people, for different churches in the area. They they would occasionally pack up their gear and their band and go on tours around Eastern Europe, doing street preaching and street performance. Um, and I felt there was a potential for them to do so much more. This church was talking about open heaven and revival, and it sounded more like the kind of revival that I had been believing for in the Toronto Blessing, the kind of revival where people um, reach out and affect the community around them, the kind of revival where power actually changes people's lives. And I would have loved this group to have gone even further and to be even bolder. I would say, like, why can't we do like homeless outreaches? Why can't we do I don't know. I had my head full of ideas because in my mind, um, the secular and the religious divide needed to come down because we think about the issues that only the only the government can solve. Uh, Crime, homelessness, joblessness, poor education. And we think about how all these things are, oh, isn't it awful? The government isn't doing anything about any of these issues. Like, why can't the church do something about these issues? And by extension, why can't the young people in the church do something about these issues? You know? So, this passion that was forming in my heart was for a social life drawn together under the umbrella of changing the world. I kind of believe that was my destiny, that that's how my youth was supposed to play out, that this desperate connection I needed with other human beings, with other young people, this experience of being young and being a teenager and adventure and exploring and making connections with other people and romance and all of that would all be fulfilled and facilitated by these strong connections with other young people who were passionate about changing the world for God like I was. And that in some sense, shape, or form, there would be a kind of a community that would grow and persist and that would be embedded in my local area, and that I would be a part of that, and that together we would be involved in transforming things. In getting involved in all of the areas that the church doesn't normally get its fingers stuck into because it's afraid of kind of progressing into the secular domain. Um, you know, and I believe that that was my destiny to kind of be brought together in this community and to find my identity there and to find my place there among other young people. And I didn't know if it was going to be exclusively with this particular church group, um, or with some other groups that I was involved in, or some people I hadn't even met yet. But that's what I thought. And when people would say to me, seek first the kingdom of heaven, that's what I would think. I would think, okay, if I seek first, reaching out and changing the world for Jesus with other young people, then the social connection, the romance, the adventure, the excitement of youth that I have been missing will come. And unfortunately, that did not happen. Things did not go to plan. I wish to God things had gone differently. And I think I'll probably leave that one for a later discussion because I want to circle back because I feel like I've skipped over a lot. I love that church. The pastor was this very bombastic, larger than life character who just was so welcoming to me. I remember the first day I went, um, he was working on the sound desk because they had to set up PA in this because they didn't have a church building. They had a mechanic, they rented out a room from a mechanics institute and they were setting up the PA equipment. And he was freaking out and he was saying, "Why isn't it working? Why isn't it working?" And I just walked over and I picked up the plug and I said, "Because you haven't plugged it in." And he looks at me like, "Ah, thank you." He plugs it in. "This is still not working." And I reach over to the back of the desk. I say, "Because you haven't turned it on." And that was my first day helping with the sound equipment at that church. And that's what I was. He said, you've got this job for life. You've got this job for life." And so this little, well, probably what, 15-year-old kid sat behind the sound desk, often with the pastor throughout most of my time at that church. And it was awesome. I loved setting up and setting down the technical equipment. I loved it. And I've got to be honest, the kind of the Sunday school type things that they experimented with for a while weren't great because again, they just got some very nice young woman to kind of do the youth leading. But really, what really kicked it off was when we started having the pastors' two kids run their own midweek youth services, midweek youth meetings. That was when everything became very powerful and dynamic. And yeah, I cared for those guys an immense amount. They were the apple of my eye. But things were getting out of hand. And I was getting out of hand in the sense that I was still out of my depth very often. You know, that girl I really, really fancied at the King's Kids Network, I remember there was a lot of overlap between church and that group. And I remember they used to come to the rock concerts that were organized periodically. Well, not rock concerts, they were generic concerts. And I remember sat behind stages, part of some sort of organization of it all. And one of them turned around and says, "Do you like her?" I'm like, "No." I think it's not quite the same as Peter denying Jesus, but it felt that two-faced because it was just so out of the blue. Do you like her? They asked me. And she was right there, sat on the other side of a room. Like, no. And the answer should have been yes. Hell, I remember the first night of the King's Kids camp. We were playing some sort of game. They invited me because they realized I was a little bit more mature, perhaps, a little bit more cerebral than the other kids in the because they split you into pre-13s and 13 plus in that organization for dorms and for activities. And the 13 plus were allowed to stay up later and do games. So we were playing games. I was opposite this very attractive young woman again, who must have been 15, 16. Um, I'm imagining 15 really because yeah. Um, and it just must have been obvious that I was very attracted to her because one of the things they were doing is kind of like kind of there was a game where if you lost, you were meant to do a dare. I mean, it was stupid things like cluck like a chicken or hop on one leg or stupid stuff like that. It didn't wasn't even remotely risque. Um, but one of the other kids was like, "Well, I think we should do a dare where if Peter loses, he has to kiss her." I'm like, "What? You can't make a dare like that." They said, "No, that's not allowed." And I just turned the brightest shade of red ever known to mankind. So I was always hanging around the older girls and this girl particularly, but I just didn't know how to talk to them about anything other than just I could talk to them cerebrally about facts and information and spiritually about stuff to do with the church and our activities, but kind of like personally, I never figured it out how to make those personal connections. Yet I hung on every tiny detail of their personal lives that slipped out in conversation. And I dreamed of having the courage to get one alone and actually tell them how I felt. That's probably true of all of the women in my teens, all of the young girls in my teens. I used to um, be attracted to. I always thought if I ever get them alone, then I'll have the confidence to tell them how I feel. And I was almost never alone with any of them. That's life. You don't appreciate how insular my life was, how coddled and how inexperienced I was at everything. I was driven everywhere. I couldn't catch a bus. I didn't understand the bus schedules. I'd never been taught to ride the buses. Um, I had no idea how to get anywhere or do anything. I didn't have any money of my own because, I didn't have any kind of uh, my pocket money was not enough to cover more than sweeties. And, I was not one of these kids who was given an allowance for clothes that they could then skim a little off for social activities. That was not the way my life worked. Um, and so if my parents didn't arrange it or facilitate it, my social life didn't happen. And I was not aware how to break out of that. I wasn't even aware I could break out of that or that there were options there. I remember walking into a computer shop with my mother once, and I must have come off as being super mature. I did actually. I know that as a child, people often mistook me for being several years older than I was, not necessarily because I look old, but because I spoke really formally and sometimes really technically in a really adult way. So people kind of assumed I must be a young looking older kid with a lot of, you know, when in reality I was a younger kid who had a really older way of speaking. And so I got into this conversation with the computer salesman. Um, and I would have been about 15 at the time, I think 14, 15. And um, yeah, and he was like, "Oh, you're incredibly knowledgeable about computers and all of the stock we have here. Is you ever interested in like a part-time job or some work experience or something?" And I looked at my mum like it really intimidated because suddenly in through my brain flashed all of the complexity of trying to get in and out of this uh, i- on public transport to this place on my own for work. Um, the complexities of whether I'd even be allowed to work at my age, what kind of paperwork that might involve, what kind of trouble I could get into if I upset a customer. All of this was flashing through my head at high speed, trying to figure out what the answer was and what I should say. And I think my mum stepped in at that point and just pointed out that I think it was 15 at the time. It was like, oh, I assumed you were older or something like that. But actually having a little part-time job of my own would have been great because I could have used that disposable income to have a bit of social independence, which would have done me the world of good. I got into big fights with my mum over wanting to get out and do things that she didn't approve of, partly because I wanted to have fun and experience the world, but partly also because I wanted a social life and need to get out of the house and do things to have a social life. I wanted to do karate. My mum didn't approve of martial arts. It was too violent and full of Eastern mysticism. You fight with your brother too much. If you do martial arts, you'll just be encouraged to fight with him more, this sort of thing. Um, and I wanted to go down to the local laser tag arena. And I knew that we were young kids there, like teenagers who had memberships who played games like every other day. They hung around there after school. I could make friends there. No, don't approve of those kids. Don't approve of those places. Lots of bad influences. Not allowed. and you're not allowed to go there unless we take you, kind of thing. Um, and so it's kind of my life was very cosseted, very closed because of my mother's fear of bad influences and my father's fear of some sort of harm. He was always a worrier. You know, I'd had some interest in rock climbing and mountaineering, and he was like, "Well, if you're going to do rock climbing, you're going to do it at like a professional place, indoors." Like, there's no point in that. That's not. It's conquering the mountain that's the fun part. And also, I didn't like the idea of practicing on vertical walls. When I think about rock climbing, I thought kind of like going up the sides of quarries, because that's kind of we used to play in quarries as kids. And by playing quarries, I mean decommissioned quarries. They weren't active quarries anymore. They were tourist hotspots. You had tourists walking around, but you'd have leftover quarry stones heaped up in piles. Um, and bits of earth where the quarries had just taken bits of rock out, and you could very comfortably scramble up and down them. And my dad had a fit when I'd do that, but I'd do it because they took us to them because they're tourist hotspots. Portland Bill, I think, particularly. Um, and like that was my idea of rock climbing. My idea of rock climbing was going up a kind of 45-degree rocky slope, uh, not holding on by the tips of my fingers off a vertical wall, you know? I didn't think I was able to do that. That was too intimidating for me. And so like I want to go out and do some mountaineering and we get some abseiling and like, nope, 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 no. Too dangerous, freak out. No, no, no. And they then complain that I'm overweight and sedentary. It's like, well, that's the way it is. You can't just give a kid a bike and say, why don't you go ride your bike? Particularly not when you actually freak out if he actually tried to ride it on the roads. Because one of the things I'd say is you don't let me ride my bike on the main roads. You let me ride it up and down our little side road, and you let me ride it in the park. You don't let me actually. I suppose by the time I'd hit my teens, they might have let me ride it, but by that point it was too late. I was already put off by riding bikes. Um, um, I'm not going to push my bike for 10 minutes to get to a park so I can ride it about for 10 minutes and then push it back for 10 minutes. That's not happening. That's not happening. I never really got on well with the other kids in our street because there weren't that many of them. And also the age differences weren't great. Um, they were either older or younger for the most part. I got on quite well with our babysitter. We had a babysitter who was a lovely Catholic girl and quite dishy actually, because again, remember I was coming up, my early teens. Um, Probably not considered dishy these days, but it was it's a woman. It's a full-bodied woman. Kind of 18, 19-year-old woman. Wow. Actually, she wasn't quite 18 yet. She was finishing high school, so she must have been 16, 17. Um, and it's like we had lots of really fascinating intellectual conversations when my brother kicked off. Quite fond of her. Not super, super fond, but certainly fond enough to have more than a few fantasies. And she would not have considered herself to be one of the glamorous, sexy ones. No. She would have considered herself to be something of a plain Jane. But it was so interesting hearing about the world of high school through her eyes. Um, she told me once that she had a super aggressive reaction to Coca-Cola. Like she'd have blackouts and not remember what she'd done. That sort of extreme. And one time on a school trip, she was there with one of her younger sister's friends, and they persuaded her to drink Coca-Cola, and she woke up, X amount of time later thinking, "Oh my goodness, have I made out with my sister's guy friends? That would be so mortifyingly embarrassing." And she hadn't, but she had to kind of check on it. Coca-Cola has the same effect on her as like huge amounts of alcohol. And like Never got her to drink any Coca-Cola when she came round, unsurprisingly. But I was learning, or would learn, I bet it sounds something to come back to in my next video. I was learning much about the world from the internet and videos and um, computer software. I remember uh, one of the first things I did when I got my new computer was it came with a CD encyclopedia. Uh, and the CD encyclopedia, one of the first things I did was put it into the computer and go to the search function and type sex and read every article on the topic that there was, because that's how little I knew about the world. But I learned probably more through books and the internet and multimedia encyclopedias than I ever did from just talking to my peers, which meant all of my knowledge of this sort of stuff was probably quite accurate and technical. Um, but my knowledge of like the social context was just totally non-existent. And I just had no idea how to make friends outside of, an activity, particularly mostly church activities. And of course, I put all of my energy into those friends who I thought were most on fire for God. So there was this other youth group that I was going to called The Manor, and it was run by I think it was literally a Calvinist church. It was super, super stale, old. It was a kind of church where if you'd been to a Toronto Blessing meeting and been prayed for or had laughed or anything, they would suggest that you come for deliverance ministry because you were probably possessed by a demon. It was very much the age of miracles is over. We are all sour, dour people. But they had a youth ministry. In fact, the youth leader was a lovely, lovely, lovely lady. I only saw her the other weekend. And they were vivacious and full of fun. And the kids in that youth ministry that I went to, they had like a little youth cafe every week in the church's coffee shop. They took it over and had a youth cafe, and they were very, very not religious. They were somewhat irreligious, um, and badly behaved, the kind that would end up kissing girls around the back of the shed or playing spin the bottle and that sort of thing. And I kind of turned my nose up at it a little bit, and I wish I hadn't. I remember one of them saying, "Okay, that's great. You're really serious, but what about fun?" And I was like, "Well, my idea of fun is quite serious, and I shouldn't have been. Shouldn't." We were like, I will probably circle back to this, but there was one girl who asked me out, and the reason I turned her down is because even though at this stage I knew that the girls I had a crush on were unattainable and weren't interested in me, I turned her down because I didn't think it was fair. I didn't think it was fair to date someone when you had feelings for someone else. I thought that that was mean. And in retrospect, that was bloody stupid. I think. I think I should have listened to the kids there more. Maybe it wasn't always necessary to be so serious. But I remember, in my own way, I deeply loved that place, and it didn't come along until a little bit later. I think until around when my timing is kind of screwed up. And again, there was crossover because some of those kids had come to the King's Kids boot camp with their youth leader, connection through my mother, and some of those kids had come to the King's Kids boot camp with their youth leader, connection through my mother, and they'd had all these dynamic spiritual experiences, and the leadership of their church were horrified and pulled them all out, and they never had anything else to do with it after that initial event. They were kind of all yanked out of the program, as it were, because of how horrified um, that some of these the pastors were, that some of these children had had these deep spiritual experiences. Um, and I think it took them a while to set up their own separate thing, but they did set up this youth cafe a few years later, and I started going. And I wish I'd been a little bit more worldly like them. I mean, that was in my mind, it was later on, a later phase of life, and I will talk about it more in the second half because I think I'm probably going to talk about my late teens later on and when everything went very, very, very badly wrong. Very badly wrong. Um, but yeah, I thought that was my identity. I thought I was going to possibly even move in with some other young people in some sort of. I actually had a ruined building. There was a building, an abandoned industrial building, that I had my eye on, thinking, I just feel drawn to that building. I feel like we may end up setting up base there one day. And in my head, we would end up setting up base in that building and doing amazing things. We'd turn it into kind of like an all-purpose space. So we'd have like an innovation space where we would try and create and design things that we could spin off into new businesses. And we'd have a media space where we would kind of make productions and televise and videos and things, and we'd have a kind of a worship and dance space, and it would kind of be like this hub where we would all come together and we'd reach out, and I'd hoped eventually we'd set up some sort of like homeless shelter, and we'd start do like information gathering, kind of neighborhood watch stuff, like finding out what was happening in our local environment in terms of why there was so much crime there, and maybe we could help the police with information or something. But alas, none of that ever happened. But I longed for that life of fellowship. And it's really difficult, I think, for adults to understand how tightly entwined in my head the two were. On one side was my intense desire to kind of like stay out late on a wall eating fish and chips with my mates, snogging a girl, sneaking her out of a window, to go off and spend time with her late at night, something like that. Whatever I imagine teenagers did, sneaking into concerts, or I don't know, getting into mischief. It was very difficult to express to you how tightly that was married in my head to the idea of also having an adventure for God, changing people's lives, impacting my local community. Um, you know, because I wanted to get involved in the most desperate of situations. Wanted to help people get off drugs. Wanted to help prostitutes get off the street. We wanted to help homeless people find homes. Wanted to help people get into employment. We wanted to bring Jesus to people. We wanted to bring the church outdoors into people's everyday lives. And I cannot express to you in my mind how tightly those two things were married together. And the fact that the one didn't happen kind of undermined the other. And neither one happened. Neither one happened. And it felt like they needed to be together. That was the plan. That was God's plan. And that was my hope. And that's what made me feel alive. And that's why I call it the best of times, because I felt I knew who I was and what I was aiming for. And I felt like I had the strength to achieve it. Everything was lined up, you know? What I was looking for was a more aggressive, more dynamic version of the group I found at this church, this youth group. It seemed to be lining up, and then it wasn't.